The map existed before the mapmaker arrived. Every schoolchild learns that Ferdinand Magellan sailed into an unfamiliar ocean in 1521 and named it the Pacific after the calm winds he happened to find that season. Smooth story, clean narrative. Europeans discover, Europeans name, Europeans own. Except the Austronesian peoples of the Philippine archipelago had been sailing that ocean for thousands of years before any European ship crossed it, and they already called it something. They had words for it, charts for it, a relationship with it that predated the word Pacific by millennia. Welcome to Echoes of Ancients. If you find the gaps in official history worth investigating, subscribe. We explore the corners other channels do not bother with. Now, the question buried in this story has nothing to do with Magellan's pride. It has to do with how a name becomes legitimate. A word sticks to a thing when someone with a pen, a press, and an empire writes it down. The Tagalog, Visayan, and Ilocano peoples had no European printing press in 1521. So their names for the ocean did not make it onto the maps that circulated in Lisbon and Seville. And what did not appear on those maps for centuries effectively ceased to exist in the official record. The ocean that the ancient Filipinos knew by entirely different names got overwritten. The question of what those names were and what they reveal about the sophistication of pre-colonial Philippine maritime culture is the thread worth pulling. And when you pull it, the whole sanitized version of cartographic history starts to unravel in ways that many mainstream historians have chosen not to dwell on. Let us start with what the pre-colonial Filipinos knew about the sea. Think about it. The ancestors of the peoples of the Philippine archipelago belonged to the Austronesian migration wave that spread across the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins over several thousand years. Linguistic and genetic research places the origin of this expansion in Taiwan, with waves moving southward through the Philippines and outward across the ocean. The Philippine Islands were not a passive stopover. They were a hub. Archaeological work at sites like the Taban Caves in Palawan, where human remains dating back tens of thousands of years were discovered, confirms long, continuous habitation by peoples with intimate knowledge of the sea. These were not merely coastal dwellers. The balangay, the ancient plank-built boat of the Visayan peoples, required sophisticated carpentry and navigation knowledge. Archaeologists unearthed the Butuan boats in Agusan del Norte, wooden balangay craft dating back to the 9th century CE. Some researchers push the tradition significantly further back. These vessels crossed open water. Their builders understood currents, star positions, and seasonal wind patterns across the body of water that Europeans would later call the Pacific. Wait a second. The ocean had names before Magellan reached it. Fragments of those names survive in oral tradition, in epic poetry, and in linguistic analysis, even if they were never carved onto a European map. Importantly, Visayan oral tradition references the wide sea to the east with terminology that translates roughly to the great open expanse or the sea without shores. The Tagalog world carried a similar conceptual framing. These were not poetic abstractions. They were navigational categories. The distinction between enclosed seas, coastal waters, and the deep open ocean appears in pre-colonial Philippine language with a specificity that only experienced seafarers develop. The Sama Bajau peoples, the sea nomads of the southern archipelago, maintained one of the most elaborate maritime vocabularies in the region. Their taxonomy of ocean states, watercolors, current behaviors, and wind shifts represents a cartographic knowledge system that never required ink or paper. It lived in memory, in song, in the training of navigators. Calling this a naming tradition might sound like a stretch to a skeptic. But a name does not require a written map to be real. It requires consistent, shared use by a community that depends on the named thing for survival. By that measure, the ancient Filipinos named the Pacific long before any European pressed a quill to vellum. Here is where the contrast sharpens, and where the suppression, not conspiratorial suppression, but structural, bureaucratic, colonial suppression, becomes visible. When European cartographers began drawing the Pacific in the 16th century, they faced a problem. They needed information. The ocean was enormous. The coastlines were complex, and the islands were numerous and scattered across an area that defied their existing models of the world. The solution European mapmakers reached for was pragmatic and severe in equal measure. They consulted local pilots. They captured or hired indigenous navigators. Magellan himself relied on a Malay-speaking navigator, often referred to as Enrique of Malacca, whose knowledge of the regional sea lanes was indispensable for the expedition's survival. Enrique did not get to name the ocean. Let's say the knowledge that indigenous navigators contributed to European maps was absorbed silently. The names, the routes, and the hazard markers passed from oral tradition into ink, then were relabeled in Latin, Portuguese, or Spanish. The credit evaporated. The cartographic record that survived and circulated across Europe carried European names exclusively. Spanish colonial administration in the Philippines, which began in earnest after 1565, actively discouraged the preservation of pre-colonial written and oral records. The destruction of Baybayin script texts and the suppression of indigenous epics was not incidental. Colonial administrators understood, with cold clarity, that cultural memory and political resistance travel together. So the Philippine contribution to Pacific cartography was not hidden behind a locked door. It was erased incrementally, one generation of forced conversion and renamed geography at a time. But traces survived. They always survive. There's a catch. The Philippine oral epic tradition is a repository of geographic knowledge that scholars began taking seriously only in the 20th century. The Maranao epic Durangan, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage, contains navigational references and sea mythology that encode real geographic relationships. The Visayan epic Henilawad describes ocean crossings in terms that experienced maritime scholars read as containing genuine hydrographic data. The Ilocano tradition preserves sea naming conventions that predate any European contact. These texts were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were knowledge systems. Memory technology. All right. The Doctrina Christiana, the first book printed in the Philippines in 1593, used the Baybayin script alongside the Latin alphabet. It exists today. It proves that a sophisticated writing system was already in place when the Spanish arrived. The implication is uncomfortable for the official narrative. A people with a writing system, ocean-crossing boats, and a detailed oral map tradition already had words for the Pacific. They already had a name for the great ocean to their east. Spanish colonial linguist Pedro de San Buenaventura compiled a Visayan vocabulary in 1613. His work recorded indigenous maritime terminology in enough detail to confirm that the Visayan peoples possessed categorical distinctions for ocean waters that European cartographic language at the time lacked equivalent terms for. He was documenting a linguistic system that had evolved alongside centuries of deep ocean navigation. And here is the detail that lingers, the one that does not fit cleanly into any of the standard explanations. Important. The Austronesian linguistic root for the concept of a vast, open, the boundless sea appears, with recognizable variation, across languages from Madagascar to Hawaii. The ancient Filipinos stood at the geographic and historical center of that dispersal. Their terminology for the ocean was not merely local. It was the seed from which related maritime cultures across half the globe grew their own vocabulary. The Pacific, as a named, understood entity, existed in Austronesian cognitive geography before Europe knew the planet had a Pacific side. Magellan did not discover a nameless ocean. He sailed into one of the world's oldest named bodies of water and renamed it for his patron's benefit. Think about it. The suppression did not require a conspiracy. It required a system. Colonial cartography operated as a technology of sovereignty. Naming a geographic feature in a European language and publishing it in a European atlas constituted a legal and political claim. The Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and British empires understood that naming was ownership. Indigenous names threatened that logic. A map with a Visayan or Tagalog name on the ocean was, in the colonial framework, a map that undermined Spanish territorial claims. Erasing those names was administrative self-interest, not malice toward a culture. The effect on the culture, of course, was the same either way. Filipino historians and linguists in the 20th century began the recovery work. Renato Constantino wrote about the manipulation of Philippine historical memory in ways that made mainstream academic circles uneasy. Zu Salazar developed the Panteong-Pananaw framework, a methodology for reading Philippine history from within Filipino cultural and linguistic logic rather than through a colonial lens. These scholars did not frame their work as alternative history. They framed it as basic accuracy. The ocean naming question sits within that framework. It asks a plain question: whose account of an event counts as authoritative? For 500 years, the answer to that question was determined by who controlled the printing press. The cartographic record, as it exists in European archives, presents the naming of the Pacific as a European act. That record is accurate in a narrow sense. Europeans did write the name down first, at least in the surviving documents that circulate in global institutions. But accuracy in a narrow sense can coexist with profound distortion in a broader one. The ancient Filipinos named the ocean. They knew it, charted it in memory, encoded it in poetry, and built the boats to cross it. The European name arrived later and endured more widely because it came attached to military power and colonial administration. Think about it. The ocean did not change. The power did. Filipino scholars today, working at institutions like the University of the Philippines and Ateneo de Manila University, continue the linguistic and archaeological excavation of pre-colonial maritime knowledge. The Butuan boats sit in the National Museum of the Philippines. The Baybayin script is undergoing a revival among younger Filipinos. The oral epics are being transcribed, translated, and taught. The recovery of the original names, the Visayan, Tagalog, and Ilocano words for the Great Ocean, is an ongoing project. It moves without drama, without press releases, at the pace of careful scholarship. Wait a second. The Pacific still carries Magellan's adjective. That will not change on any current map. But a name given by people who crossed an ocean without compasses, who read the stars and the currents and the birds, and who passed that knowledge forward across 100 generations, does not disappear because a later power chose not to write it down. It waits, the way old things wait, patient and indifferent to the argument about who got there first.